can start.
Yeah. So in this presentation, we will talk about the Argila-Ascoli theorem, which characterizes the compact subsets of the space of continuous functions on a compact matrix space. Under the matrix is
Can you
the super. Yeah.
are you using your mic or something? Can you just keep it closer? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now is
Now
it audible?
it's better. Yeah. No, it was audible earlier, but it was feeble. So now it's better. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So in this presentation, we shall talk about the proof of Argila-Ascoli theorem, which gives a necessary and sufficient condition for a subset of the space of continuous functions, continuous real valued functions on a compact matrix space is compact, where the metric is the suprema metric and the topology that induces by the metric. So we observe that the space of continuous functions is an infinite dimensional non-linear space. So here we cannot use Heine-Borel theorem to characterize using closed and bounded. So because the closed unit ball here is not compact. So we need some more condition to ensure that a subset is compact. So to this end, we first give a condition under which a set is relatively compact. So the notion we introduce here is the notion of equicontinuous family of functions. So let X be a matrix space and P be a point. We define a family of functions where all functions are assumed to be real valued. Is equicontinuous at some point P if the condition of continuity, that is for every epsilon, there exists a delta such that if a point is at delta distance from the point P, then their functional values are at a distance epsilon. But in this case, we want this condition to satisfy by all the function of the family. If in such a case, we call a function to be equicontinuous family. So, and now if the family is equicontinuous at every point, then we say that is equicontinuous family on X. Here are some example for this kind, for this definition. So one is that if X is a convex open subset of Rn, and this is a family of differentiable functions on X, then if all the functions, the derivative of all the functions are bounded by some constant, then that is a equicontinuous family. That can be proved using mean value theorem, and you get a estimate for fx minus fy less than m times something. And another example you can give the family of function Lipschitz which satisfy Lipschitz condition uniformly. That is, all functions satisfy a same Lipschitz constant. That is also family of equicontinuous function, and that is the same condition with a minor change in, that is, Holder space in the if satisfy a family of functions under some alpha, where alpha is the Holder constant. So this kind of example gives a class of examples for equicontinuous family. And one more condition, one more thing we require is the notion of total boundedness and relative compactness. So a matrix space is called totally bounded if for every epsilon there exists finitely many points such that the space can be covered by union of finitely many balls of radius epsilon. And we say a subset is totally bounded if it is totally bounded as a subspace of the matrix space. And another notion is relative compactness. That is, a subset is called relative compact if its closure is compact. We characterize the family with respect in terms of these conditions. So here are some results that I recall from matrix space theory, but without proof. Sometimes, if it's possible, I'll give the proof orally. So one is that a set is totally bounded matrix space, then all of its subsets are totally bounded and its closure is totally bounded. And that is not very difficult, because if I take a closure, then every point from can be made epsilon by 2 close from the point of y, and every point of y can be made epsilon by 2 close from finitely many points can be put in a ball of radius epsilon by 2, and then by triangle inequality it is possible to make epsilon close to a point of y. Similarly, it can be proved for subset. So these are two results. Another thing is the relative compactness. Any relatively compact subset of a metric space is totally bounded. This is because let S be a relatively compact subset, then its closure is compact. Now every compact subset is totally bounded because we can consider ball of radius epsilon at every point that will give an open covering, and by compactness we can find finitely many open balls that cover. Therefore, it's totally bounded, and now closure is totally bounded means the subset is also totally bounded by the previous proposition. Now, and another proposition is any totally bounded subset of a complete metric space is relatively compact. So to start with a totally bounded subset, then we can take it again. It's to prove that its closure is compact. So we take its closure, that will be a closed subset of a complete metric space, and hence it's a closed complete metric space again. Now we know the equivalent condition for a subset to be compact in a metric space. That is, a subset is compact if and only if it is sequentially compact, if and only if it is totally bounded and complete. Now closure of that set is a complete and totally bounded. Therefore, it is compact. Therefore, we prove we can see that any totally bounded subset of a complete metric space is relatively compact. Okay. Using this, we will try to state the theorem and give a proof. So let X be a compact metric space and F be a family of functions in Cx, the space of real valued continuous functions with sup norm topology. Then F is relatively compact if and only if it is bounded and equicontinuous. By boundedness here, I mean that uniformly bounded. That is, there exists one constant such that all function, the norm of every function is less than that particular constant. Okay, so let's start the proof. Okay, first for the forward direction, suppose F is relatively compact, then by our proposition it is totally bounded, and we know that every totally bounded subset is bounded in a metric space. Therefore, the family is bounded. Now we have to prove that it is a equicontinuous family. So we prove that it is equicontinuous at every point. So fix a point x0 arbitrarily in X and choose an epsilon greater than 0. And using the fact that F is totally bounded, we can find finitely many G1 to Gn is continuous, such that the balls of radius epsilon by 3 centered at those points cover F. So that is, if the F will be there in the sum of the balls. So in that F satisfy this condition, that a norm of F minus Gm is less than epsilon by 3 for some index m from running from 1 to n. Again, since all the Gns are continuous, so this is continuous in particular at x0. So we can find delta n such that the condition for continuity will be satisfied at x0, that is gx minus gnx minus gnx0 is less than epsilon by 3 whenever x is at a distance delta n. Now we are dealing with a finitely many functions gn. Therefore, we can choose delta to be minimum of all delta n. So let us fix that delta. Therefore, for every f in the family, by total boundedness, we have this criteria, and by the choice of delta for any x with this x is if x is at a distance x0, at a distance delta from x0, then we can use triangle inequality to get a bound for this fx minus fx0. That is what we want to prove a function to prove a family to be equicontinuous. and we want this condition to be satisfied by every member of the family. So this fx minus fx naught is less than this three quantity gx fx minus gmx plus this and this. Now the first one is less than epsilon by 3 by the choice of the function gm, and second one is less than because gm is continuous and delta is the value which is the minimum, so this will be satisfied for all delta, or in particular for delta m. And the third one is again by the choice of gm. Therefore this quantity is less than epsilon for all function f in f. Therefore f is equicontinuous family, and we have proved previously that it is a bounded set. Now for the converse direction, suppose f is bounded and equicontinuous. We want to prove that f is totally bounded subset, because that will suffice, because Cx, the space of continuous function under sup norm, is a complete metric space. Therefore, as we observed in the proposition, that totally bounded subset of a complete metric space are relatively compact. Therefore, it is sufficient to prove that the space is totally bounded. So for this, we fix an epsilon positive. Now we use equicontinuity of f. So for any p, let us choose arbitrarily, there exists, there should be a delta p, such that for all x, if x is at a distance delta p from p, then for any f, this condition is satisfied, that fx minus fp modulus is less than epsilon by 4. Now this observe that this delta p very much depend on the point. So if we vary the point over the x, we get a family of open balls around p with radius delta p, and that will cover the whole space x. Now since x is compact, this open cover will have a finite subcover. Say that covering is x equal to union of this delta pn, delta pn. That should be a n anyway. Sorry. Now the idea is we have a family of equicontinuous function. We go to a space where we know that we have to prove that it is totally bounded. We have to go to a space in a finite dimensional space where we know that boundedness is equivalent to total boundedness. There we prove total boundedness, and then we use that property to prove the total boundedness of f. And yeah, all the functions are valued, so we value this f, any f on the family at those finitely many points, p1 to p capital N, and that will give an n tuple in Rn. This is my subset Z that in Rn lives inside Rn. Now Rn is finite dimension. So suppose because f is bounded, so there is a uniform bound for all functions. So you can choose R such that R large enough such that the norm f is less than R for all f, and therefore in particular mod fx is less than R for all f and for all x. Therefore using the standard Euclidean norm, that norm of f p1 to f pn is less than R square n times, that is R mod n for all n. Here we could have used any norm, because Rn is finite dimensional, all norms are equivalent. So for simplicity, we use the only two norms. Otherwise, you can use any norm. So in this norm, Z is a bounded subset of Rn, because all functions are, this is the bound. Now we observe that any bounded subset of any finite dimensional space is totally bounded, because suppose if it's a bounded subset, then we take its closure, and the closure will be a closed bounded subset in a finite dimensional space. Therefore, it will be compact by Heine-Borel theorem. Now, every compact set is totally bounded. Therefore, its closure will be totally bounded. Hence, the original set will be totally bounded. by this total boundedness, we'll be able to choose finitely many this Z1 to Zm, such that the condition for total boundedness is satisfied with epsilon equal to epsilon by 4 here. Okay. In terms of our notation f, in terms of our functional notation f1 to fm, it states that the distance between this, that Euclidean distance between fpi and fmpi, that is less than epsilon by 4. For now, this is an easy triangle, easy inequality that mod x is less than root over x square plus y square. Using that each of the component, the modulus of each of the component is less than this quantity, and which is also less than epsilon by 4. So we have that inequality. Now, using this inequality, we'll obtain the total boundedness for the family. Now we have control over f, and control over f, but only at the finitely many points, p1 to pn. Again, we have we know that this condition is also satisfied, that these finitely many points, the ball around those with radius delta n covers x. Now we have control on both the things, that control on x and control on the family. Yeah, we use these two conditions to simultaneously to choose a delta n. So let us fix a x. Then, since this x covers is here, the equation 1.1, that x covers is covered by this finitely many ball. So x will lie inside one of the ball, say delta n. Yes. Therefore, if x is at a distance delta n from Pn, then we can get an estimate for this quantity, fx minus fmx. That is, if we introduce two more quantity, fpn and fmpn. Okay. So the first one, and use the triangle inequality. The first one is less than epsilon by 4 by equicontinuity at Pn. Second one is less than, again, second one is less than by this above inequality, that fpx is this one, this is less than epsilon by 4. And again, the third one is less than epsilon by 4 by equicontinuity at Pn. So that is less than 3 epsilon by 4, and which is less than epsilon. And this is satisfied for all x. Therefore, the supremum over this is also less than epsilon. Therefore, f is totally bounded. And m, we can choose fm in such a way that fm is here. Fm with this property, the total boundedness of Z. Now, as we observed previously, that Cx is complete and f is total bounded, therefore it is relatively compact. So we have characterized all relative compact subset of Cx. As a corollary of it, we state the Arzelà-Ascoli theorem, the one version, that when the subset will be compact. Now, here we need the closedness, because closedness is a necessary condition, because any compact subset of a metric space is always closed. Now, this closedness is also sufficient, that will prove. So if it is, let us see, suppose f is compact, then it is closed, hence f equals to f closer. And this proves that f closer is relatively compact. Now, relatively compact, by the previous theorem, is bounded and equicontinuous. So one direction is clear. For the converse, suppose f is closed and bounded and equicontinuous. Now, bounded and equicontinuity together imply relative compactness. Therefore, f equals f closer, and f closer is compact, and that shows that f is compact. So that is another version. Now, yeah, the last one is useful in proving some theorem in operator, compact operator way. So I mentioned this result, that every sequence, when a sequence of continuous function will have a uniformly convergent subsequence. So that actually can be proved directly using some diagonalization argument in some particular cases. 0, 1, but we will obtain this as a corollary of this. So if any take a sequence of continuous function in Cx, then if we let's say for this to have a uniformly convergent subsequence is equivalent to the condition of sequential compactness, because the convergence in the supremum metric is equivalent to the uniform convergence. Therefore, now in a metric space, we prove that sequential compactness is equivalent to compactness. Therefore, if all these three conditions are satisfied by the family of function, that is closed, bounded, and equicontinuity, then every sequence will have a uniformly convergent subsequence. Yeah. So that is the proof. Now we mentioned some consequences of it. One is in the complex analysis. That is, we know that if a holomorphic function is holomorphic on the sequence of function, if it is holomorphic on a compact in a compact neighborhood and it converges, then the limit is also holomorphic. So, but here if we can prove that it is bounded on every compact subset, then there is a convergent subsequence that is holomorphic. So another condition is another application I mentioned is the in the operator theory, that if the integral operator with kernel kxy, that is when it will be a compact linear operator. That is in the sense that when a image of a bounded sequence will have a convergent subsequence, and we can use this theorem to get that this is a compact operator. And finally, this is to prove the existence theorem of solution of the initial value problem using the Peano's theorem, that is can be also proved using this Archila-Ascoli theorem on this, if it satisfies some regularity condition. Thank you. That's any.
That's all?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, any
Any
questions?
questions?
No question? Okay, maybe you can remove your file. Dia can continue.
Okay. Stop sharing.
Okay, I'll also join with my iPad, yeah, so that I can also write the question. Yeah, hi. Okay, should I? Okay. Is this visible?
Yes, this is.
Um, Sorry, 1 second. There's some charger cord is doing something. Okay. Okay. So, okay. Is this visible? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to present the Riemann mapping theorem, and the proof is a bit complicated, so I'll try to go quickly because I only have like half an hour to 45 minutes. Okay, so first things first, I'll get some things out of the way. So what is the Riemann mapping theorem? It says that any proper open simply connected subset of the complex plane is biholomorphic to the unit disk. Now, by biholomorphic, I mean there is a holomorphic map to the unit disk, which is whose inverse from the unit disk to that subset is also holomorphic. And so the subset in question needs to be open. It needs to be simply connected in that it has no non-contractible loops. I think I think we can get away with non-contractible C1 loops in this case, but yeah, that's just a technicality. It's probably fine. The Riemann mapping theorem has some historical import. It was the first hint towards the more general uniformization theorem, which is about Riemann surfaces as a whole. So in there, a non-compact Riemann surface, the open kind, would be biholomorphic to either the whole plane or the disk. So in this case, we all sort of have a similar result, which is that any subset of the plane, which is simply connected, which is not the whole plane, is the disk, is biholomorphic to the disk. Yeah, so as in, yeah, I'm just mentioning that for a simply connected Riemann surface that is non-compact, this is also true, sort of. So this crucially uses the Arzel-Ascoli theorem, which is why I'm presenting it today. So some black boxes beforehand that I should let you know about. One is the open mapping theorem, because so mainly what I will require is that a bijective holomorphic map is itself a biholomorphism. So one comment about this. So the point here is that if there is a very close connection between univalence, f prime of z, some z not being equal to 0, and injectivity for holomorphic functions specifically, because their derivative matrices are so regular. They're of the form A minus B, B, A. So the point is that if I have an injective holomorphism from S to somewhere, then well, firstly, f prime cannot be 0 at any of those points, because say f prime were 0, then then locally the function would not be injective is the point. So for example, if f prime were 0, then its power series expansion would have some a naught followed by no linear term followed by a square term, meaning that it would take value a naught with at least arity 2. I mean, yeah. So I'm not going to prove this. I'm just going to take this as a background thing. So I'm just going to move on from this very quickly. Secondly, we'll be liberally using lifting along various covering maps. I mentioned all those covering maps explicitly, but just as a rule of thumb, it should be remembered that if I lift a function along a holomorphic covering map, if I'm able to lift a function along a holomorphic covering map, then the result is also holomorphic. And so the reason this is so useful for proving this theorem is because if I take a simply connected subset of the plane, then I can lift map from it along any holomorphic covering map because of simple connectivity. So this is seen most obviously, for example, if I took a simply connected subset of the complex plane minus the origin, then I can define a single branch of, say, the square root function on the entire set, because it is simply connected, because it has no loops around origin, because those would not be contractible. Yeah, so this occurs a lot. So I'm assuming this from complex analysis. And the third is Morera's theorem, which is that to test whether something is holomorphic, it suffices to show that all the integrals around closed piecewise C1 paths is 0. Okay, so these are just the preliminaries. I want to get these out of the way, and we're moving on. And the approach is we start with S, which is a proper simply connected open subset of the complex plane. We want to exhibit a biholomorphism from S to D, the unit disk. Now we fix some naught in S, and we look at the family of injective holomorphic functions, which will take Z naught to 0. So this is just a, well, there is some reason for fixing this Z naught, but that will be apparent later. So firstly, we need to show that there are such functions to start with. It might well be that there are none. So then we'd get stuck, because how would we exhibit a biholomorphism? Then we need some wideness condition on this injective holomorphic map. The wideness condition in particular will be that f prime of Z naught has the highest modulus among all functions in F, in capital F, in script F. So now the point about this is that f prime, the modulus of f prime Z naught is approximately how much F stretches small disks around Z naught, locally speaking. So the intuition behind that is this. I will get to the explicit reason for choosing this condition in a bit. And last of all, we need to show that there is an F belonging to the script F for which f prime Z naught is maximum, that the maximum is attained inside F script F. And so firstly I need to, okay, so the second step was such a wide function, so function that has f prime Z naught maximum, is surjective. So if we obtain that inside F, we will automatically have an injective surjective holomorphism into D, and we'll be done, because a bijective holomorphism is a biholomorphism. Yeah, and we'll be done. Okay, so now first things first, we need to show that, so there are the approach has 3 parts. We need to find an embedding, we need to show that wide embeddings are surjective, and then we need to show that the wide embeddings exist to start with. So first things first, why does there exist any holomorphic embedding from S into the unit disk? Now, if S were bounded, this would be obvious, because if S were bounded, it would sit inside some large disk, and then we could scale that disk down to get a map into the unit disk. Because scaling by some complex number, or scaling by, in this case, a real number, honestly, is a biholomorphism. Yes. Now the point is that S is not in general bounded, which is a problem. But we are told that S is a proper subset of the complex state, meaning that there is a point X that is not in S. The utility of this is that so I'm using the fancy language here. I'm lifting it along the 2 sheeted covers C0 0 to C0 X. All this means is that I am taking the square root map. So if I shift C0 X to C0 0, that is subtract X, then the 2 sheeted cover from C0 0 to C0 0 is squaring. Z goes to Z square. Now that this is a cut away from 0 is just saying that the derivative is non-zero. But the point is that I can define a well-defined square root for S translated to origin, because S is simply connected. So there is some well-defined branch of the square root map. There are 2 possible branches, but there is some well-defined branch of the square root map on S, because S is simply connected. Now, this is the crucial point of this argument. So this basic strategy will come up a lot in this proof. Because we took the square root map, and because the square root map is well defined, if say, okay, so I'm going to call, okay, should I switch to the, no. Okay, so say I'm calling this set root S, just as a notation. If some P belongs to root S, then minus P cannot belong to root S, because the branch of the square root that we took is well defined. So now this is the crucial fact. Now root S, so okay, so the point here is that root S is open because the branch of the square root map you took is injective, and an injective holomorphic map is open. And S, and therefore the entire negative of root S is omitted from root S. For any P belonging to root S, minus P does not belong to root S, which means that there is an entire open set U that is missed by J. J is the embedding from S to root S. So there is an entire open set U that is missed by J, and that is good, because that means there is a disk contained there's a open disk contained somewhere in that open set U. And what that means is that if I took the so if I took some Y belonging to U and I took an open set around it and I inverted root S, what that does is that it maps the inside of that disk to the outside and the outside to the inside. So it inverts the modulus of every element in root S, meaning that the entire root S gets mapped into the disk that we took around Y. I'm using very geometric language. I can write this out on my iPad if anybody requires clarification. But the point is that once this is done, I have managed to create a bounded mapping of S into something, which means that I can scale this. So there is a bit of a subtlety here. I can scale this to get a map into the unit disk. Now, what I mean by shift is slightly subtle. So the map I get a priori does not take Z0 to 0. That's true. I just took some arbitrary map into some bounded disk and I scaled it and translated it to be into the unit disk. It does not a priori take Z0 into 0. However, the map, so the unit disk has automorphisms taking any point to 0. So I can take a biholomorphism from the disk to itself, which takes Z0 to 0. Specifically, the map is Z minus Z0 by 1 minus Z0 bar Z0. So I will not write that out explicitly, but the point is I will be using that sort of holomorphism repeatedly, a holomorphism that takes some specific point of the disk to 0. Now, once that is done, if I compose with that, in summary, I will get some map from S to the unit disk, which takes Z0 to 0. So we produce some element of F, stripped F, which means that F is not empty. Okay. Now, next thing. Wide embedding. So I'll call a function in F wide if F prime of Z0 has the highest modulus among all the functions in stripped F. Now the point is that such functions intuitively have the largest range, largest image, and in fact they are in fact surjective. So they have the widest possible image. They're all into the unit disk mind because they're from F. Okay, so now how do we prove this? We say, suppose there is some Q that is outside the image of S. And again, we apply that shifting that I told you about earlier, which is I apply a biholomorphism of the unit disk that shifts Q to 0. So without loss of generality, I am assuming that F actually misses 0. As in 0 is not in the image of F. And now this is the clever part. This is the part that both this proof of the Riemann mapping theorem and a large part of the proof of uniformization rests on, which is producing clever covering maps of punctured disks and punctured planes. Okay, there is a variant of this proof using the J function, which I quite like, but that would be unfair to use here because I would not be able to define the J function in time. But the point is that here the map I'm using is Z going to e to the Z plus 1 by Z minus 1. So that covers, that uses the unit disk to cover the disk minus the origin. And again, remember that Fs is simple. So, okay, first things first, F is an injective holomorphic map from S to Fs. Because it's an open map, it's a homeomorphism onto its image, meaning its image is also simply connected. Fs is also simply connected, right? Meaning that I can lift F along P. The point of doing this now a priori I'm not changing the codomain of it much. It was a map into the disk. It still says a map into the disk. But now the benefit is that essentially but 0 has been pushed out. So this map that I took P, how do I put this? What is the inverse image of 0 by this map? As in, for e to the Z plus 1 by Z minus 1 to result in 0, you would need the Z minus 1 part to be 0. As in, you would need the e to the minus infinity type. Right. I'm just hand waving essentially. But for that to happen, Z would need to be on the boundary of the disk. Z would need to be 1 specifically. Okay, so now the point is that I will now shift the lift that I get. I'm not named the lift anything because the lift is not the important part. I'll shift the lift so that finally Z0 again maps to 0 over, if I do this whole thing. So the point is I first shifted F to miss 0, then I lifted F, then I shifted it again so that Z0 maps to 0. This is the function I claim is wider than F. Now that is a problem. So why is it wider? Firstly, I'll get to that in a second. But the point is that if we produce a function that is wider than F, then F could not have been a wide embedding to start with, which will then imply that wide embeddings are surjective because there cannot exist such a cube. Okay, now why is H wider? This is a very clever application of the Schwarz lemma. So the idea is that F can be written as sigma 1 P sigma 2 H. Why can this be done? So H was obtained how? We applied some automorphism of the disk to F. We lifted F, we lifted the resulting map, and we applied another automorphism of the disk. So I'm just inverting that process. So the inverse of an automorphism is itself an automorphism. The inverse of lifting is applying the covering map. Now, the reason I've written it this way instead of in terms of the lifting correspondence is because this is cleaner. Because the lifting correspondence is not quite one map, as in I can't say that I applied some single map to say sigma 1 inverse F to get the lifted map, because I did some branch peels. That's a complicated thing, which is why I've written it as F is some automorphism, compose the covering map, compose an automorphism, compose H, which is altogether phi compose H for some phi. This phi is the crucial part. So that means that the derivative of F at Z0 and the derivative of H at Z0 differ by the derivative of phi at a specific point, specifically at H of Z0, which is 0. And this is what the Schwarz lemma comes in, because H has been designed so that it takes Z0 to 0, and F already took Z0 to 0, meaning phi takes 0 to 0. Moreover, P is a map from the unit disk to the unit disk, and sigma 1 and sigma 2 are automorphisms of the unit disk, meaning phi is a map from the unit disk to the unit disk, which takes 0 to 0. So the Schwarz lemma applies to it, meaning that the modulus of F prime of 0 is less than equal to 1. That is the content of the Schwarz lemma, or modulus of F phi Z is less than equal to Z, mod Z. But we're using the form where the modulus of F prime 0 is less than 1, less than equal to 1. And it's not injective. So if equality holds in Schwarz lemma, then phi would have to be a rotation. It would have to be scaling by some A, and the modulus of A would have to be 1. But rotations are automorphisms. And that is not allowed, because in the middle of phi, there is a pesky covering map which is not an isomorphism. So that covering map is not injective, meaning phi altogether is not injective, meaning phi is not an automorphism, meaning phi prime of 0 must be less than 1. And that is the crucial fact. So F prime of Z0, the modulus of that, is the modulus of phi prime of 0 times the modulus of H prime of Z0. But that means that F prime of Z0 is smaller than H prime of Z0, because phi prime of 0 is smaller than 1. And this is the very clever application of Schwarz lemma that is basically at the heart of this. And now, lastly, the using the Arzel-Ascoli part. So this is how we get that there is in fact a wide embedding inside of script F. So first things first, we define lambda to be the supremum, the width, the maximum possible width of a function in F. So we need to show that lambda is attained. Is basically what we need to show. Supremum over H belonging to F mod of H prime Z0. So we need to show that lambda is attained. First things first, lambda is not 0, because like I said, the derivative of so like I said at the beginning, the derivative of an injective holomorphic map is never 0, meaning that whatever embeddings we produce that were in F do not have H prime Z not equal to 0, meaning that lambda is positive. This is going to be required in a second. So now we choose some Fn such that mod of fn prime z naught goes to lambda. We don't know anything about the fn. The fn might not converge, the derivatives might not converge, nothing might work. But it turns out they do. So thank you Orkut for including this version of the Arzelà-Ascoli theorem in your presentation. It helps here. So now F is a uniformly bounded family is obvious because they all map into the disk. Their norms are all bounded by 1. F is locally equicontinuous. Now, so as Orkut mentioned, so if you have local uniform boundedness and local equicontinuity, then for holomorphic functions on subsets of the plane for now, then you can assert compact convergence, meaning you have uniform convergence on compact subsets of S. S is open. Yeah. So this is crucial because as we will see, compact convergence preserves a lot of holomorphic properties. So it preserves holomorphy to start with, and it preserves. It will also preserve injectivity in this case. So okay, now. F is uniformly bounded. There is no locality necessary there. It is just uniformly bounded. F is locally equicontinuous. This is a result of Montel. I will prove it here. This is also stated as a family of functions that is uniformly bounded is normal. Normal means that it satisfies the result of the Arzelà-Ascoli theorem. It is relatively compact in the topology of compact convergence, meaning uniformly convergence on compact subsets. So I will prove the Montel thing, and once we have that, we'll be able to apply Arzelà-Ascoli to say that Fn has a convergence subsequence which converges on compact subsets to some continuous F. Now we need to show that continuous F is A holomorphic, B injective, and therefore, yeah, A holomorphic and B injective, that's all. And therefore we will have that, and okay, and also that the derivatives of Fn converge to the derivative of F. Which will mean that the derivative of F is exactly lambda, which is good for us because then we've produced an F that is a wide embedding and therefore a biholomorphism to the disk. So it remains to prove the Montel theorem and the part after this that I will come to in a minute. So the Montel theorem, it rests basically on equicontinuity, and the equicontinuity rests on the Cauchy integral formula, let's call it. The point is that for holomorphic functions, if I take, okay, so the text, most of the text here is not important. Point is, for holomorphic functions, Fz can be written as the integral of f zeta 1 by zeta minus z around a suitable small circle. And this is crucial because it shifts the all regularity properties of f to regularity properties of 1 by zeta minus z. This is a very common theme. This is also what you do for if you were integrating with respect to some kernel or whatever. Convolution shifts properties from the function itself to the kernel. So now fz minus fw can be written as 1 by 2 pi I, and here the integral I've taken is slightly wider than, so z and w are both r close to some a. This is where the locality comes in. So I take some small r ball around A, and I take Z and W both in there, and I take the circle along which I'm integrating to be slightly larger, some 2r. And the point of doing this is that anything inside this circle is quite far away from things on the boundary of that larger circle. Okay, so now this difference is equal to what I've written on the last line. There is no equal to symbol there, but it's what I've written on the last line. And you can see here that this integral in modulus is bounded by a product of several things. So the product of 1 by 2 pi times the length of this curve, which is 4 pi r in this case. The supremum of f, which is mod f with the supremum non, over this disk. And the modulus of the z minus w and the modulus of the denominator. Now, because we've taken zeta to be on a larger circle, the distance of z and w from zeta is larger than r. this is if you want, you can prove this by triangle inequality, but this is also a very geometric fact. So if you have a smaller disk of radius r, and you take something inside the disk, then the distance of the thing from the circle of radius to r is at least r, because the straight line joining the radius will, something on the boundary of this disk will have distance r from that disk. Okay, so now that means that the denominator is bounded below by r square, which means that this whole expression is bounded above by 1 by r square, right? So the whole thing is bounded by a lot of things. If we consider r a constant, I've just taken r small enough and fixed it. This is bounded by some constant times the supernorm of f and z minus w. Now, the benefit we have of knowing that f is a injective holomorphic map into the disk is that the supernorm is just bounded above by 1. F is bounded above by 1 everywhere. There is no subtlety here, which means, crucially, that there is a constant depending only on r, which functions as a Lipschitz constant for f, which means, in fact, that f is equicontinuous, meaning because if I took delta small enough that, you know, z minus w is less than epsilon by the constant, then mod of fz minus fz naught would be uniformly less than epsilon. Yeah, so all of f is locally constant, locally Lipschitz with the same constant, which means that it is locally equicontinuous, meaning that it has, by the Arza-Lascoli theorem, it has a subsequence, the Fn has a subsequence which converges on compact subsets uniformly to an f. So here, just by the way, I'm using that the Fn is a subfamily of a relatively compact family, which means it is itself relatively compact because its closure is contained in compact set. Okay, now the part is which is that a non-constant limit of injective holomorphic maps is itself injective holomorphic. And this is the crucial part where holomorphy plays like a large role here. So that this will give us that because f is the limit of injective holomorphic maps, and because we will show that the fn prime converge to f prime. So f prime z naught is not 0, which means that f cannot be constant. So that would mean that f is a non-constant limit of injective holomorphic functions. So it is itself injective holomorphic, meaning f will be in stripped f, and so we'll be done. That will be the end of our proof. Because we have found a wide embedding. So that will be from S to D by holomorphism. Yes, and this is, this all amounts to taking the appropriate contour integral and applying compact convergence to it. So the idea is that, okay, so so I'm taking some A, I'm taking a compact subset that is away from A right now. And on that compact subset, due to compact convergence, due to uniform convergence on that compact subset, even Riemann integrals will be respected by that uniform limit due to uniformness. So now that means that integral of f and z will uniformly converge to integral of fz. That means the integral of fz will be 0. So in Morera's theorem, f will be holomorphic. So it will be differentiable. Now, the second thing I've written here evaluates to some constant times fn prime of A. This is just, I'm applying the Cauchy-Rezzi formula for the power series of f around A, fn around A. Applying compact convergence to this means that fn prime of A converges to f prime of A. Yes. And we've already shown holomorphic. The last one is the crucial connection between valence and injectivity that you will develop. So if fn, if f takes the value A set twice, say fx equals A and fy equals A, then so firstly f has no poles, which means that the function I've written here, f prime of z by z minus a, we'll have two, we'll have at least two poles, right? Because fx is x is the pole of that and y is the pole of that. And this integral will count exactly how many times, well, exactly how many times up to taking double values, but at least this integral will come out to be greater than equal to 2 for f. Because the by the Cauchy residue theorem, there are yeah, there are no poles of f to count here, and there are some zeros of, there are no poles of f minus a to count here, and there are some zeros of f minus a to count here. So this will come out to be a positive integer and greater than equal to 2 if f is not injected. But that means by applying uniform convergence again, that for sufficiently large n, this quantity, which is always going to be an integer, will be itself greater than equal to 2, which means that fn will not be injective, which is bad. Fn started from f, which is not possible. So f will have to be injective. This is what I meant about testing balance using the derivatives. Okay. So now all of this is done. We have fn prime converges to f prime. F is holomorphic, and f is injective, meaning that f belongs to A and is wide. And so we're done. In summary, we've shown that there is a wide embedding, and it's the biholomorphism from S to the unit disk. In fact, one taking z0 to 0, because all of the fn's take z0 to 0. So f is also going to take z0 to 0, pointwise. There is a related proof using green functions. There is also one using J. There are a lot of proofs of the Riemann-Roch theorem. And I just wanted to mention that because in the embedding we produced here, log mod f of that is a green function. So that's a harmonic function that has a certain singularity property. Yeah, so green, the reason I mention all this is because a lot of the ideas that we have here, when used with green functions instead, which are a bit easier to construct in piecewise fashion, we can extend some of the ideas here for a full uniformization proof. The reason I'm so obsessed with uniformization is because I did a presentation on that for another course earlier. So yeah, but yes, that is the conclusion, and yeah. There are probably some questions because I was very fast about a lot of things. If anybody needs me to explain something again.
Yeah, any questions? Well, it's okay with everyone? Any questions? Well, if you are lost or something, the point is, I think the point is, you have a sequence of functions, sequence of holomorphic functions, which are bounded on compact sets uniformly. Then you want to get a, you want to get a subsequence which converges uniformly on all compact sets of them. That is where the Arzela-Ascoli is used. Okay. So I think that's what you should take it. I mean, even if you there the Cauchy integral formula is used. I mean, to prove the EQ continuity, you use the Cauchy integral formula.
Exactly.
So yeah, the other things, if you don't digest, I think it's fine. So that's what. If you have any question, you can ask.
I'll go back to the.
Yeah.
This is the basic point of the use of Arzela-Ascoli.
Yeah.
We're trying to find the f which is good, and we have a sequence that would converge to something good if we could find that it did.
And I think all of you can prove it using Cauchy integral formula. I mean, it's an easy exercise.
Yeah, I mean, this is the exercise essentially.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So maybe we will stop recording this, quit and start a new recording for the S1 raised test. So if you have any question, you can ask me. So if you don't have any question, I will end this session and start a new session. Okay. So goodbye. Maybe, yeah. See you.